If you've never had the urge to learn a second or even third language, today's list might just convince you otherwise. From people having different personalities depending on which language they use, to healing faster from brain injuries and enhanced pain tolerance, you're going to be glad you landed here today. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 fascinating facts about multilingual people. 25. Different personalities. If you've ever been around someone who speaks more than one language, you might have noticed that switching languages can change their attitude, sense of humor, or even their body language. Each language has its own habits and expectations which shape how people express themselves. People often show more emotion in their first language, while language learned later can make them speak more slowly and carefully. Even how someone shows politeness or fairness can change depending on the language they're using. Researchers call this cultural frame switching. Each language brings out different cues, which helps explain why people who speak more than one often adjust to new social situations more easily than others expect. 24. Slower brain aging. When researchers like Ellen Bialystok at York University started comparing multilingual and monolingual adults in the mid-2000s, they quickly noticed something interesting. People who use more than one language every day often show dementia symptoms several years later. We're talking about a delay of 4 to 5 years, which is quite significant in neurological terms. This difference isn't because multilingual people have more education or came from wealthier backgrounds. Researchers made sure to control for those factors. The more likely reason is that switching between languages keeps the brain active. The parts of the brain that handle focus, planning, and self-control stay active, which builds what researchers call a cognitive reserve. Now, this doesn't stop Alzheimer's or dementia from happening, and researchers make that clear. However, it does seem to delay when symptoms first appear. 23. It makes kids better at switching tasks. Children who grew up hearing and using more than one language get extra practice and skills that help them stay focused. Every time they decide which language to use, they also have to put the other languages on hold. That back and forth builds the parts of the brain that handle paying attention, staying organized, and moving from one task to another without getting stuck. And it starts early. Even toddlers who aren't fully fluent yet show signs of stronger mental control. I can also debunk that old wives' tale of bilingual children struggling because they might mix languages or start speaking later. Modern research from groups at York University, the University of Washington, and several European child language labs keeps proving that it's simply not true. They develop just fine and often come out ahead in areas like problem solving and early reading. 22. Their brains look completely different. One of the most surprising findings in neuroscience is how much a multilingual brain changes over time. Brain scans show that people who use more than one language build denser gray matter in areas that handle language and focus. The bridge between the two sides of the brain, called the corpus callosum, often grows stronger too. It works a lot like practicing an instrument. The more someone plays, the more the brain adapts. With multilingual speakers, every switch between languages is another workout. The brain responds by strengthening the pathways that do the heavy lifting. All this shows how adaptable the human brain can be, even in adulthood. 21. They have more control over distractions. Managing multiple languages trains the brain in a very specific way. Every time multilingual people speak or listen, they have to keep the active language in play and set the unused ones aside. That simple routine strengthens the brain's ability to block out anything irrelevant or that doesn't matter. Researchers at the University of Florida tested additional control in a 2023 study published in Bilingualism, Language and Cognition, and multilingual adults consistently filtered out distractions better than monolinguals on non-language tasks. The same pattern appears in daily life. They juggle tasks more smoothly, handle busy environments with less stress, and stay focused when others don't. Repeatedly choosing the right language tightens the brain's ability to filter out the noise and to zero in on what matters. 20. They like to choose logic over emotion. Ask someone to work through a tough situation in their native language, and instinct usually takes over. But give them that same scenario in a language they learned later, and the decision often gets made with a bit more thought behind it. Research led by Albert Costa at Pompeu Fabra University found that decisions change when we use a foreign language. People react less to fear and rely more on actual facts. Scientists think the extra language gives a bit of emotional space, just enough to help us think things through. It doesn't erase the feelings, but it helps people to look at the problem before the emotions take hold, which often leads to better choices when the pressure is on. 19. They have better recovery after brain injuries. Losing language skills after a stroke can be very difficult, and the recovery process is different for each person. But the people who speak more than one language often have a slight edge. Every language forms its own network in the brain, and these networks overlap enough to help each other. So if one path is damaged, another might still work. This shows up in interesting ways during rehabilitation. A patient might begin speaking their second language first, or switch between their languages as different areas begin to recover. Therapists say these patients frequently relearn words and grammar more easily because they already know how to manage more than one language. 18. Multilingualism comes with increased memory capacity. Studies consistently show that people who use multiple languages in daily life perform better on tasks that rely on short-term recall, sequencing, and mental updating. And the effect isn't limited to young adults either. Older multilingual adults often show stronger working memory than monolingual adults of the same age, which suggests years of language switching help reinforce these skills. The most important factor, however, is that they have to use the languages actively. People who rarely use their additional languages don't see the same benefit. But for those who move between languages regularly, that ongoing practice gives their memory a quiet boost that shows up in learning, planning, and problem solving far beyond language. 17. They learn new languages faster. Some people seem to pick up new languages faster than everyone else, and research from the University of Tokyo helps explain why. After learning 2 or 3 languages, people's brains get better at noticing patterns, remembering new sounds, and understanding grammar. As a result, learning another language feels less difficult. Professor Kuriyoshi Sakai and his team tested this idea by asking bilingual and multilingual volunteers to learn basic Kazakh, a language that was new to all of them. The multilingual group picked up the grammar and sentence structures more easily, even when they only heard the language. Their brain scans also showed stronger activity in the areas linked to language learning, which supports the cumulative enhancement model. In simple terms, every new language strengthens the skills needed for the next one. Instead of competing, language knowledge adds up, giving multilingual people a definite advantage when they start learning another language. 16. Their cultural empathy is stronger. Language is more than just words. It also reflects how a culture sees and explains the world. When someone uses more than one language, they start noticing that ideas don't always line up neatly from one culture to another. A joke that works in one group might fall flat in another. Or something that sounds 100% polite in one language can feel too direct in another. Studies done by the University of Arizona show that multilingual adults often score higher in perspective taking and social openness, which helps them to read situations more accurately. These skills become especially useful in workplaces where teams come from different backgrounds. If you've got one or more multilinguists on the team, there'll be fewer misunderstandings, more conversations, and not to mention, more trust. By engaging with several linguistic worlds, multilingual speakers learn how culture influences thinking and behavior, which helps them to connect better with others. 15. They handle curveballs better. Anyone who juggles more than one language learns to roll with constant adjustments. A word might not translate cleanly, a sentence structure might feel unfamiliar, or a cultural nuance might need a different approach. Each of those moments is a small curveball that forces the brain to pause, reassess, and come up with new solutions. David Green and Yuban Abutalibi, who created the adaptive control hypothesis, found that handling more than one language helps the brain adjust quickly when rules or expectations change. This means multilingual people are more likely to try new strategies if their first idea doesn't work. This kind of flexibility is useful everywhere and can really make a person stand out in any job where problem solving, creative projects, tough conversations, or rapidly changing conditions are part of the day. 14. They're more creative. Creative people often credit their imagination to books they read, the places they've lived, or the people they've met. Researchers studying multilingual adults point to something else entirely. They've noticed that people who use several languages often approach problems with more options. Rather than sticking to one way of thinking, they switch between different reasoning styles, which helps them come up with more flexible ideas. Research published in Frontiers in Psychology found that adults who use several languages come up with ideas that are more flexible and less routine. Viorica Marian's team at Northwestern University discovered more or less the same thing. Multilingual adults often produce solutions that take less obvious routes, partly because they have more than one mental framework to lean on. Whether it's storytelling, planning, or uncovering patterns, that wider toolkit shows up in their creative work. 13. They have better voice recognition. Usually people find it hard to recognize someone's voice once they switch to another language, but a study at Indiana University showed that this isn't always the case with bilingual speakers. Listeners in their experiments were still able to pick out the same voice across two different languages, even though the sound and timing were completely different. Part of the reason is that some qualities in a person's voice don't change from one language to another. The team also noticed something else. When people understood the language being spoken, they caught more of the small details that make a voice familiar, which made identification easier. Together, the results show voice recognition works on two tracks. One relies on the individual sound of a person's voice, and the other comes from how comfortable the listener is with the language. 12. Multilingualism changes people's time perception. People organize time and distance in ways that feel completely natural to them. Ask a group to describe a long wait or a short walk, and you'll hear different kinds of explanations that don't always match. Cognitive scientists discovered that the language someone uses every day plays a role in how they picture these ideas. Some languages lean on vertical descriptions, others on horizontal ones, and some focus on motion instead of placement. According to linguist Thora Tenbrink, these habits build up over years and years of speaking and listening. They determine what people notice, how they compare lengths of time, and even how they imagine themselves moving through space. 11. They're in touch with social hierarchies. In most multilingual environments, a person's language choice itself can be a clue. A person may switch languages to show respect, to create distance, or to take charge of the conversation. Studies from the Max Planck Institute and several sociolinguistic programs show that people who navigate these transitions become skilled at reading the social landscape around them. They pay attention to who everyone else listens to, who simplifies their speech to help the group along, and who only speaks up when the room settles. None of this is taught directly. It's based on years of observing how authority and rapport move from one speaker to another across different languages. 10. They're not natural lie detectors. Researchers have tested every trick in the book to see whether anyone can reliably spot a lie, and the results are notoriously disappointing. Even trained interrogation teams barely outperform random guessing. Multilingual adults don't escape this pattern, but they often approach credibility differently. Switching between languages forces them to pay attention to context. For example, what counts as polite, what counts as evasive, and how direct someone should be in a given situation. Those skills don't reveal who's lying, but they help multilingual speakers avoid common mistakes, like thinking nervous body language means a guilty conscience. In practice, multilingual people often pay closer attention to what someone says and whether the story makes sense in the situation, which is much more reliable than judging someone by their body language. 9. Sometimes it's very easy. In some regions of the world, you don't even have to be multilingual to be, well, multilingual. Speakers of Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish do this every day. Their languages are closely related, so they share enough grammar, vocabulary, and sound patterns for listeners to follow along, even if they've never formally studied the other two. Linguists call this receptive multilingualism, and it shows up in other language families too. Just think Dutch in South Africa's Afrikaans, or Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin. All these languages develop from the same base language, which means the way sentences are built and the words that fill them are already familiar. As a result, people across the region can usually understand one another without translating a thing, because the structure of the language itself does half the work. 8. They handle ambiguity better. Ambiguity shows up in every language, and multilingual speakers spend much more time dealing with it than most people realize. They learn early on that you don't always get a clean, perfect translation, and that some ideas only make sense once you understand the situation surrounding them. Because of that, they develop a higher tolerance for mixed messages. Instead of getting frustrated, they pause, sift through the options, and keep going. Multilinguals rarely get thrown off when the facts aren't neatly arranged. 7. Our capacity to learn new languages never stops. Plenty of people still repeat the idea that languages must be learned in childhood or not at all. Yet the evidence refuses to back that up. Teens and adults regularly reach levels of fluency in new languages that surprise even native speakers, and some go far enough to blend in completely. What researchers kept pointing out is that the ability to pick up a language doesn't suddenly vanish at 20 or 40 or 70. The brain keeps adjusting, absorbing, and refining whatever you throw at it. Even our first language keeps changing as we read more, talk more, and explore new corners of it. So whether someone picks up their first new language at 14 or their fifth at 60, the capacity is still there, ready to be pushed. 6. The brain uses new roots for each language. Brain scans have shown something very interesting about people using more than one language. Their brain doesn't rely on a single language center and calls it a day. It switches between different networks, depending on which language is being used and how comfortable the speaker is with it. A well-practiced language can run on smoother automatic pathways, while a less familiar one brings in more help from areas tied to attention and monitoring. Researchers using MRI have repeatedly seen the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, and other control regions light up in different patterns from one language to the next. 5. Their emotions feel different in each language. Not all languages feel the same emotionally. A phrase that seems intense or personal in your first language might sound softer in a language you learned later. Studies looking at how multilingual adults handle emotion show that this difference isn't something we only imagine. A non-native language often blunts the edge of strong feelings, which can make difficult conversations easier to navigate. In contrast, the native language tends to bring emotions to the surface more quickly. This means multilingual speakers have a unique kind of control. By choosing which language to use, they can decide how much emotion comes through in a conversation. 4. Multilingual babies. Earlier I talked about how kids benefit from learning more than one language. But did you know that the foundation for multilingualism actually begins before birth? Even before they're born, babies can hear the rhythm and pitch of the speech around them and start to recognize language patterns. Research by developmental psychologist Janet Worker at the University of British Columbia found that newborns actually prefer the languages they heard during pregnancy, and that babies born to bilingual mothers showed interest in both. For a short time after birth, babies can pick out the distinct sounds of any language in the world. Sadly, the skill fades around 8 months as the brain commits to the language used most often at home. 3. They judge morality differently. When multilingual speakers face the same ethical dilemma in 2 different languages, the answer is not always the same. A 2018 study by Galston Wong and Bi-Chen Ge at Nanyang Technical University tested early English Mandarin bilinguals and found clear language-based shifts in their decisions. The stronger a participant was in the language being used, the more their choices changed between personal and interpersonal dilemmas. Each language has its own emotional impact, which can push people to rely more on gut feelings or to think things through more carefully. In short, multilingual people do not have just one way of making moral decisions. Their judgment can fluctuate based on which language they're using, how emotional that language feels, and how often they use it in daily life. 2. They've got better pain tolerance than most of us. Pain researchers have come across their own unusual findings studying our multilingual friends. If they describe pain or any kind of discomfort in their second language, it somehow ends up with a bit less sting to it. In a study published in Pain, Javier Fernandez and his team also found that the bilingual volunteers rated different levels of heat as less intense when they switched between their first and second languages. So it does seem as if emotional distance can influence how our pain is processed. For a lot of multilingual people, the way pain feels can change simply if they change the language they use to talk about it. 1. They often experience language-dependent memories. As crazy as that sounds, studies led by Dr. Marianne and her colleagues have shown that memories tend to cling to the language used when they were created. If a person studies, argues, or confides in someone in a particular language, that linguistic setting becomes part of the memory scaffolding. Trying to recall it in another language usually feels slightly off, as if something that should be familiar simply isn't as it should be. Switch back to the original language, and the recall gets noticeably sharper. Dr. Marianne's work implies that this happens because each language nudges us to notice certain details when we learn, and the brain returns to those same cues when it searches for the memory later. And that's a wrap, and the end of today's lineup. If this list kept you interested in all the best ways possible, tap that like and subscribe so YouTube can bring you back here again tomorrow. We do a new list every day. And if you're curious about the stranger side of communication, check out our related video, 25 Unbelievable Things You Didn't Know About Language and Linguistics. It goes into the odd habits, secret patterns, and surprising stories hiding inside our everyday speech. The link should show up right about here any second now. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'll see you again next time. Like, share, comment, subscribe, notification bell, all the fun stuff. See ya. Adios. Sayonara. Auf Wiedersehen.